Committee in recess at any point. I am seeker indulgences in my being late. I was held up on another matter. Today's hearing will examine the Department of Homeland Security's role in the United States Coast Guard's acquisitions process. Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moreland, and the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen, and the gentlewoman from Alaska, Ms. Peltola, are permitted to sit with the subcommittee and ask questions of the witnesses. So ordered. Today's hearings will examine the Department of Homeland Security role in the United States Coast Guard's acquisitions process. Without objection, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Waltz, the gentleman from Guam. I think I've said that before, okay? As we begin today's hearing, it is with a heavy heart that I take a moment to remember our late colleague, Congressman Donald Payne, Jr. Proud son of New Jersey, Congressman Payne was a steadfast advocate for his constituents during his time in Congress. On the Homeland Security Committee, Congressman Payne worked to bolster the Department of Homeland Security's ability to protect Americans, respond to emergencies, and safeguard our communities. He collaborated with his colleagues across the aisle to make necessary reforms to the department's operations, including the Department of Homeland Security Interoperable Communications Act, which helped the department facilitate more reliable communications between personnel of different department components during daily operations, planned events, and emergencies. Additionally, his leadership of the Homeland Security for Children Act, which was signed into law in 2022, ensured the department is accounting for the unique vulnerabilities to children during natural disasters and acts of terrorism. Furthermore, he distinguished this subcommittee not only with his persistent advocacy, but also with his signature bow tie that elevated the sartorial character of the hearing room. We were saddened to hear of his tragic passing, and I think I speak for all the subcommittee members by stating that we will miss his persistent advocacy and genteel presence on the dais. Our thoughts and prayers are with his families and friends, especially his wife Beatrice and their triplets, Donald III, Jack, and Yvonne. I now recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Thanador, for his remarks.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez, for yielding, and thank you for your kind words about our late colleague. I would like to echo everything you said. Congressman Payne was a true public servant in the best sense. He was humble, hardworking, and kind. His work on emergency preparedness, infrastructure investments, healthcare, and the security of our nation's children will have a lasting impact for many years to come. Congressman Payne sat on this subcommittee for most of his time in Congress. When it came to issues facing the TSA and the Coast Guard, he always placed frontline workers front and center. He never missed an opportunity to thank transportation security officers, federal air marshals, Coast Guard service members, and other frontline workers and their service, and he backed up his words with action. His support was instrumental to securing pay raises and improved labor rights for TSA employees. He also sponsored the Securing Public Areas of Transportation Facilities Act of 2018, which was passed into law as part of the TSA Modernization Act later that year. His bill was helped guide the efforts of TSA and its security partners to protect public areas of airports, train stations, bus depots, and other transportation facilities. I was honored to work alongside Congressman Payne and get to know him. He will be sorely missed by his family, friends, colleagues, constituents, and staff. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. To honor Congressman Payne, I ask all subcommittee members, staff, witnesses, and the guests to rise and join me in a moment of silence. Thank you. Please be seated. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Today, our subcommittee is discussing the Department of Homeland Security's role in the Coast Guard's acquisition process. To carry out its 11 statutory missions, the Coast Guard depends on a variety of assets, from small boats and unmanned aerial vehicles to 400-foot-long vessels and complex fixed and rotary wing aircraft. These assets must be able to operate in the most austere and challenging environments and carry out dangerous maneuvers to save lives, protect our coastline and our waters, pursue and arrest criminal actors, and enforce U.S. laws. It is therefore critical that the Coast Guard be able to acquire the assets necessary to perform their duties and replace older assets with new, more capable assets as the surface and air fleet age. The Coast Guard is currently in the process of replacing several mission-critical assets and new cutters. When completed, the new national security cutters, offshore patrol cutters, the fast response cutters will replace 90 existing cutters and assume responsibility for 7 of the Coast Guard's 11 statutory missions. Additionally, the Polar Security Cutter will bolster the aging Coast Guard icebreaker fleet, and 3 heavy icebreakers will replace the Coast Guard's sole heavy icebreaker, which is approaching almost 50 years in age. The Coast Guard works hand in hand with the domestic industrial base to meet the needs of the service. Among these critical acquisition programs, there are certainly some success stories. Coast Guard has so far commissioned 54 out of the 71 planned fast response cutters and expanded the areas of operations for these new cutters to the Persian Gulf and the Indo-Pacific. Shipbuilders delivering the new FRCs on schedule and at a rate of 2 per year. Additionally, the Coast Guard will soon commission its 10th out of 11 planned national security cutters, and the 11th NSC is currently under construction. The NSCs are already fulfilling critical missions requirements in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere around the world. However, the Coast Guard has experienced major setbacks with both the Polar Security Cutter and the Offshore Patrol Cutter programs. The first Polar Security Cutter was originally supposed to be operational this year, but the Coast Guard has not yet begun construction on the first cutter. Among the factors contributing to the significant delay has been the lack of experience the Coast Guard and the domestic industrial base have in building ice-breaking ships. While several allied countries such as Canada, Finland, and South Korea have extensive experience building icebreakers and ice-capable vessels, no heavy icebreaker has been constructed in the United States in almost 50 years. And the Coast Guard has not commissioned an icebreaker of any kind since 2006. This lack of experience is demonstrated in the development of ship design for the PSC, which to date is still not at the level necessary to begin construction. Coast Guard has experienced significant issues with the Offshore Patrol Cutter program as well. Between 2017 and 2019, estimates for the ship's weight increased by more than 20%. Additionally, a 2023 Government Accountability Officer report found that the OPC program, as well as the PSC program, did not follow standard practices in developing the ship's design and technology. These issues have caused delays to the construction schedule for the OPCs and have raised the overall cost of the program, as well as the maintenance costs required to keep the cutters the OPC will replace online for longer. I'm growing increasingly concerned that the Coast Guard cannot accurately estimate the cost of its shipbuilding programs. We have seen massive cost increases to the PSC program from the initial estimate the Coast Guard had provided Congress when standing up the program. That is why last fall, Chairman Green and I requested the Congressional Budget Office to conduct a cost estimate of the PSC program. According to the preliminary findings presented by Dr. Eric Labs, the PSC program cost will be almost 60% higher than the Coast Guard's current estimate. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, existing challenges indicate that the OPC program costs will increase substantially from initial estimates. I understand that the Coast Guard is operating on a significantly smaller budget than its Navy counterparts, despite being tasked by Congress to develop, deploy, and maintain cutters that are equivalent in size and complexity to all but the largest of Navy ships. Coast Guard's entire budget request for fiscal year 2025 was $13.8 billion, with $1.5 billion dedicated for procurement, construction, and improvements. In comparison, the Navy's budget request for fiscal year 2025 includes $77 billion for procurement alone, roughly 51 times greater than the Coast Guard's procurement budget. That said, as the Coast Guard prioritizes the PSC and OPC programs, which will require the service to administer larger procurement budgets than they are used to, it is imperative that Coast Guard manages these programs effectively and efficiently. During my time as chairman of the subcommittee, the message we received from stakeholders is clear, that we have from stakeholders is clear. The demand for Coast Guard services is increasing and will continue to increase in the future. Bringing these cutters online on time and on budget will determine whether Coast Guard will be able to meet the growing demands for their assets, manpower, and expertise. Therefore, if we want to stem the flow of narcotics into our country, stop illegal fishing by the Chinese distance water fishing fleet, or maintain a consistent, credible presence in the Arctic to deter our geopolitical adversaries, the Coast Guard Acquisitions Program must deliver what Congress tasks the services to do. I thank our two panels of witnesses for appearing before our subcommittee today to discuss this critical topic, and I look forward to your testimony. At this time, I will yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez. Thank you to our witnesses on both panels for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this important topic. The Coast Guard's shipbuilding efforts and other acquisition programs play a critical role in protecting U.S. national security. The Coast Guard has an aging fleet of surface and aviation vessels. In the Arctic, the Coast Guard is challenged to maintain an adequate presence due to a lack of modern icebreakers. The Coast Guard's two existing icebreakers, the Polar Star and the Healy, are operating well past their service lives and are not sufficient on their own to meet the Coast Guard's needs. In the Indo-Pacific, the Red Sea, and elsewhere around the globe, the Coast Guard's aging assets are similarly stretched thin by increased demands. The Coast Guard is undergoing a historic recapitalization of its fleet, working to acquire modern vessels that will enhance capabilities and mission readiness. This large-scale, complex effort will take long-term investment and commitment from those of us in Congress, as well as the consistent support and oversight of the Department of Homeland Security. Already, the Coast Guard has successfully acquired and deployed a large number of new cutters through the National Security Cutter and Fast Response Cutter Program. However, the service has faced significant challenges in developing, designing, and building new icebreakers through the Polar Security Cutter Program, as well as new multi-mission cutters through the Offshore Patrol Cutter Program. These programs have faced a host of challenges, including a global pandemic, supply chain disruptions, natural disasters, contractor inexperience, and a strong labor market which is driving increased labor cost. As a result, both programs have seen significant delays and cost increases. Some of these challenges could not have been predicted, while others likely should have been better accounted for within calculated risk assumptions. Going forward, DHS and the Coast Guard must work together with partners in the U.S. Navy and the shipbuilding industry to build up an industrial base capable of regularly producing world-class cutters and other vessels according to predictable schedules and budgets. These efforts will be critical to not just the success of the Polar Security Cutter and Offshore Patrol Cutter programs, but to building Great Lakes icebreakers, waterway commerce cutters, Arctic security cutters, and other cutters not yet envisioned. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and about how we can learn lessons from the past few years to improve Coast Guard acquisition programs and ensure effective DHS oversight. I thank our witnesses, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Thanedar. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Again, I am pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this critical topic. I ask that our witnesses please rise and raise their right hands. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ms. Shelby Oakley serves as the Director of Contracting and National Security Acquisitions for the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Ronald O'Rourke serves as the Specialist in Naval Affairs for the Congressional Research Service. And Mr. Eric Labs serves as a Senior Analyst for Naval Forces and Weapons for the Congressional Budget Office. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Ms. Oakley for 5 minutes to summarize her opening statements.
Good morning, Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanedar, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about Coast Guard's shipbuilding programs and their challenges. I'm a relative newcomer to DHS and Coast Guard acquisitions. I have spent the majority of my GAO career assessing acquisitions at NASA and DoD, in particular Navy shipbuilding. Given my unique experience, I can say that some of the fundamental challenges and disappointing outcomes I see with Coast Guard acquisitions are not unique. However, I will also say that the Coast Guard and DHS are not doing themselves any favors or the taxpayers any favors when they point to factors outside of their control as the primary cause for these outcomes. Coast Guard should do more to address what it can control. For example, GAO's extensive body of work on DHS and Coast Guard has resulted in 40 recommendations aimed at improving how it manages its acquisitions. As of today, about half of these recommendations remain unaddressed, or we have already closed them because the Coast Guard didn't take action in time for them to make a difference. Given the Coast Guard ships cost billions to acquire, and they play a vital role in securing our homeland, my statement will focus on what the Coast Guard needs to do to improve outcomes for its existing and future shipbuilding programs. First, I will cover the main challenges that have plagued the Coast Guard's highest priority programs, OPC and PSC, and missed opportunities for improvement. Second, I will discuss leading practices that GAO has recently identified to help provide DHS and Coast Guard with a new path forward for achieving better outcomes in its ship programs. Both the OPC and PSC have struggled with achieving a stable design to support construction. This is a key leading practice to achieve predictable outcomes. For OPC, we found that DHS and Coast Guard allowed the program to repeatedly proceed through design points intended to prevent programs from moving forward when they're not ready. This happened despite significant risks and our recommendations to the contrary. For example, OPC was authorized to start construction on the first 4 ships without fully developing a critical technology or completing key portions of the design. For PSC, we found that the program continues to struggle with design even after 5 years. Several factors that should have been red flags from the start have contributed to this, including a lack of heavy polar icebreaker expertise in the industrial base and the complexity of the design. Additionally, the shipbuilder and Coast Guard underestimated how many design changes they would need to make to meet Coast Guard specifications and made costly design errors, such as designing the lowest deck of the ship at the wrong height. Both programs are not meeting their original cost and schedule goals and are now reevaluating the feasibility of their current estimates. Specifically, the OPC lead ship delivery is delayed almost 4 years and costs have increased by $11 billion, and the PSC lead ship is delayed by about 5 years and costs have increased by at least $2 billion and potentially more, as my CBO colleague will testify. In the meantime, the current fleet is aging and crews are having to work harder to keep existing ships operational while they wait for the new ships. Our work on leading practices for acquisitions, which has spanned decades, presents opportunities for the Coast Guard to improve. For this work, we gathered and vetted practices from successful commercial companies to identify how they deliver innovative products that meet cost and schedule expectations. The bottom line, when thoughtfully applied, the practices leading companies follow for designing and constructing ships improve outcomes, even when cultural and structural differences yield different sets of incentives, priorities, or requirements. At a very high level, companies establish realistic, executable business cases. They use their processes, tools, and expertise to continually reevaluate their business cases to ensure that programs are on track and will take quick action when the business case deteriorates. These practices and the many open recommendations I discussed earlier provide a good starting point for the Coast Guard to consider new approaches to acquiring its capabilities to meet its important missions. It is safe to say no one is happy with the results the Coast Guard is seeing, and change is needed. Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Tanadar, and members of the subcommittee, this completes my oral statement. I'd be pleased to respond to any questions, and I also want to take a moment to express my condolences about Mr. Payne.
Thank you, Ms. Oakley, and now I recognize Mr. O'Rourke for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Thank you, and my condolences also regarding Mr. Payne. Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanadar, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. With your permission, I'd like to submit my testimony for the record and summarize it here briefly. As requested, my testimony focuses on the Polar Security Cutter, or PSC program. Estimated PSC procurement costs have increased about 39% since the contract award 5 years ago, but still appear to be significantly underestimated. 3 potential sources of cost growth, if fully realized, could increase PSC costs another 30 to 40%, and 2 other sources of cost growth could increase them further toward the figures in CBO's testimony. The Coast Guard could respond to this potential cost growth by granting contract relief to the PSC shipbuilder through a request for equitable adjustment or using PL 85804, as was done for the builder of the first 4 offshore patrol cutters. Mr. Chairman, as you mentioned, the Coast Guard originally aimed to have the first PSC delivered in 2024, but the ship's estimated delivery date has been delayed repeatedly and is now expected to occur no earlier than FY 29. The parent design strategy used for the PSC program was intended to reduce the PSC's design time, but 5 years after contract award, the expected reduction in design time does not appear to have been realized, suggesting that the parent design might now more closely resemble what I refer to as a PDINO, meaning a parent design in name only. Limited numbers of available naval architects and design engineers also appear to have contributed to delays in maturing the PSC design. At this stage, one option for substantially accelerating the construction of polar icebreakers would be to complete the maturation of the PSC design and begin building PSCs at the program's current shipbuilder, Bollinger, and at some later point introduce a second shipbuilder to build additional PSCs in parallel to those being built by Bollinger. Given the Coast Guard's requirement for a total of 8 to 9 polar-capable icebreakers, including 4 to 5 PSCs and 4 to 5 medium polar icebreakers, one possible approach might be to introduce a second shipbuilder to build the 4th and 5th PSCs while Bollinger completes the first 3. Another possible approach would be to have Bollinger build all 4 or 5 PSCs while accelerating the start date of the timeline for designing and building the medium polar icebreakers. These are not the only possible options. A 2017 National Academies report recommended using a common basic design for both the PSCs and the medium polar icebreaker. The Coast Guard, however, has testified that it wants the new medium polar icebreakers to have a shallower draft than the PSC. This could make it difficult to employ a common basic design for both types of icebreakers. Building PSCs in parallel at 2 shipyards or accelerating the start of the timeline for designing and building the medium polar icebreakers, or increasing annual OPC procurement quantities so as to replace the medium endurance cutters more quickly, could require substantially increasing annual funding levels in the Coast Guard's procurement account. Substantially increasing that account might also make the use of block buy contracting, which can reduce ship procurement costs, appear budgetarily less risky to Coast Guard officials. Since FY10, funding for the Coast Guard's procurement account has remained relatively flat in nominal terms, while the Navy shipbuilding budget has more than doubled. The amount requested for the Coast Guard's procurement account for FY25 equates to about $1.1 billion in constant FY10 dollars. The Coast Guard testified in 2013 that an annual procurement funding level of about $1 billion would almost create a death spiral for the Coast Guard. The budget displays for the procurement account in the Coast Guard's annual budget book lack certain basic information about the Coast Guard shipbuilding programs, including estimated per hull total procurement costs and scheduled delivery dates. These omissions can impede the ability of members and their staff to identify and track year-to-year changes in per hull procurement costs and delivery dates, which in turn can make it more difficult to conduct effective oversight of these programs. Congress may consider whether to direct the Coast Guard to include in its annual budget justification book budget displays for its shipbuilding and aircraft procurement accounts that are modeled after those in the Navy's annual budget justification books, which include this kind of information. Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanadar, thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I'll be pleased to respond to any questions the subcommittee may have.
Thank you, Mr. O'Rourke. I now recognize Mr. Labs for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too want to express my condolences at the passing of Congressman Payne. Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanadar, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify about the procurement costs of the Coast Guard's heavy polar icebreaker program, known as the Polar Security Cutter. In consultation with committee staff, I have focused this short statement on providing a summary of the Congressional Budget Office's report on the Polar Security Cutter, which Chairman Green and Chairman Gimenez requested. That report is currently being drafted, and we expect to publish it this summer. In February 2024, the Coast Guard notified the Congress that the first Polar Security Cutter would experience cost growth of more than 20% and that the ship's production would be delayed by another year. As both the Congressional Research Service and the Government Accountability Office have noted, in the 5 years since the contract for the first ship was awarded, development and design of the Polar Security Cutter has progressed slowly, and little work on building the first ship has been completed. In that time, the Coast Guard's design estimate of the ship's light ship displacement, a key indicator of costs, grew by 40%, while its cost estimate for a 3-ship program increased by just 16%. Regardless of the contract structure, that was going to be an untenable situation. While the lead ship's design is still incomplete, the service is hoping that the shipyard will be able to begin substantial construction on the lead ship early next year, with an estimated delivery date in 2029. The Coast Guard expects to release a revised estimate of the cost of the 3-ship Polar Security Program later this year. At the committee's request, CBO conducted an independent cost estimate of the Polar Security Cutter. The results of our analysis indicate that the procurement cost of the first Polar Security Cutter would be about $1.9 billion. Subsequent ships would average about $1.6 billion each in constant 2024 dollars. Thus, the procurement costs of the current program of record for 3 Polar Security Cutters would be about $5.1 billion. That amount is 60% greater than the Coast Guard's most recent publicly released estimate, which was provided to CBO by the Coast Guard in March. And of course, a program greater than 3 ships would cost additional money. Let me briefly provide some background on how CBO conducted its estimate. When it comes to assessing the cost of new naval shipbuilding programs, including those of the Coast Guard, CBO estimates are derived from a model that largely uses a ship's weight to calculate its costs. Essentially, CBO estimated the costs of the new Polar Security Cutters in the same way it estimates the cost of new naval ships. CBO identified ships acquired in the past that were similar to the Polar Security Cutter and calculated the cost-to-weight ratio of the most analogous ship. The agency then used that ratio as a critical input into estimating the cost of the new ship. CBO found that the best historical analog for the Polar Security Cutter was the Coast Guard's existing medium icebreaker, the Healy. Built in the 1990s, the Healy, though a medium icebreaker, displaces about 16,000 tons of water when fully loaded. It is larger than the Polar Star, a heavy icebreaker built in the early 1970s that displaces 13,200 tons when fully loaded. even though the Polar Star has more installed shaft horsepower, which, among other things, makes it a heavy icebreaker. The Polar Security Cutter would be significantly larger than them both, with a full load displacement of about 23,000 tons, and would have improved capabilities compared to its predecessors. In conducting its analysis, CBO started with the estimated cost per 1,000 tons of lightship displacement of the Polar Security Cutter using data on the ship provided by the Coast Guard. Lightship displacement is the weight of the water a ship displaces without its crew, stores, ammunition, or fuel or other liquids. CBO then adjusted it to account for current industry conditions and the inexperience of U.S. shipyards in building icebreakers, as well as the efficiencies that shipyards gain as they produce additional ships of a given type. CBO applied those adjustments to the estimated cost of the first ship of the class to estimate the cost of all subsequent Polar Security Cutters. Finally, CBO adjusted its estimates to reflect its expectation that the cost of labor and materials would continue to grow at a rate that is 1 percentage point faster in the naval shipbuilding industry than in the economy as a whole, as they generally have for the past several decades. The CBO estimate does not represent an upper bound, but rather represents our best analysis of what the PSC should realistically cost. There are reasons to believe that the final price of the ship could be lower than what CBO estimates, but there are also reasons to believe why the final price could be higher than what CBO estimates. I hope you find this information helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Labs. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I don't know if it was you, Mr. Labs, or somebody said that the Coast Guard is hoping to begin construction later this year, but didn't they hope to have the first icebreaker in operation this year?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I did use the word hoping. It was the best term I think I could come up with under the circumstances of the troubled history of this program. So delays in the past are no guarantee that those delays are not going to continue in the future.
Where are they? If anybody can answer this, where are they on the design? How close are they to beginning construction on the icebreaker?
The most recent information that we have on that is that they're about 67% complete with their functional design. GAO's best practices would say that you should have 100% of your basic and functional design complete by the time you begin construction, including systems that run throughout the ship called distributive systems. So the Coast Guard, I know, is hoping to make the case to start construction by the end of the year. And so 67% to 100 is quite a lot of work to happen over the remainder of the year to hit that marker, even at their own marker of 95%, which is different than ours. It's a significant amount of work remaining.
You're saying that there is 67% design completion
Yes.
after 5 years?
Yes.
That's completely. Do you have any estimate on the private sector? I come from Miami. Royal Caribbean, Carnival, Norwegian, they're based out of Miami. They design their ships in Miami. And they do a really good job designing ships on time, on budget. It's money, okay? For them, it's money, all right? So do you have any estimate how long it takes for, say, Norwegian or Royal to design one of their new ships? Just design, and I'm not talking about construction, but do you have any estimates on the private sector side of this?
I don't have exact numbers, but it's certainly not 5 years. And it's certainly not the case that they overpromise how quickly they're going to be able to do it, because it is money, right? These companies need to be able to start booking trips
Right.
on these ships. And so our work looking at leading commercial shipbuilders and buyers across the world has found that they're able to predictably design and pump out ships by following some of the best practices that we talk about, like completing their design, relying on existing designs, and limiting their modifications of those designs to, certain areas of the ship that are most important for meeting their business case. There's a number of other practices that our work has identified, but it's a completely different mindset and completely different set of outcomes.
They also have, really impressive technology, computer-aided design. do we have such capability, or are we still doing stuff, with, on a board and you're drawing, with pencil and eraser and a ruler? How do we designing ships? Are we also using computer design, and do we use the latest in that technology in trying to help us design our ships?
I think we're a little further behind in the U.S. shipbuilding industrial base, companies themselves, in the types of tools and practices that they use for digitally designing the ships, although they have made some progress. The things that we've seen from companies is that those digital tools and those digital designs allow them to understand the impact of their changes. And it allows them to understand their progress, and it allows multiple people, including decision makers, to understand the progress of the ship in real time. And it's a big distinction, but it's a distinction that enables them to have efficiency and effectiveness in their design efforts.
Well, I'm a landlubber, so I know about this stuff, okay? Do you think there's intellectual curiosity on the part of not only the Coast Guard, but our armed services in looking at what the private sector is doing, how they design their ships, how they procure their ships, and trying to learn from them? Or do you think it's, no, we know better because, we're the Coast Guard, we're the Navy, we know how to do this, and we don't really need the private folks to tell us what to do or show us what to do?
Yeah, in my experience, I can't comment as much on the Coast Guard aside from recent statements by the Commandant, but the Secretary of the Navy is very focused on taking what he can from these leading companies and applying it to commercial shipbuilding. I think there is unfortunately an attitude within the government that we have too many roadblocks to be able to do what commercial companies do. We're the government. We have all these policies and regulations, and they can't be overcome without really critically assessing how we could apply these practices and what we could take to be more efficient. The other thing I'll say really quickly is that some of these practices require investment, right? Being able to set up digital tools and infrastructures to be able to support this will require enterprise-wide investment, both on the part of the Navy, the Coast Guard, and the shipbuilders that we have yet to really see supported and incentivized.
My time is up, and I actually overrun my time, but I will be coming back for a second round because I do have some follow-up questions for you. Thank you, and now I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez. Well, the DHS and Coast Guard has confronted a host of challenges in its polar security cutter and offshore patrol cutter programs. Some of these challenges were truly unforeseen, such as global pandemic causing unprecedented supply chain disruptions. Others were unfortunate, but perhaps within the realm of what can be reasonably expected to occur over the course of a long-term acquisition program, such as hurricane causing disruptions to the shipyard and challenges in finding a sufficient workforce. Now, I ran small businesses for many, many years. And, one of the proper planning, cost control, are things that is just second nature for a small business because there is not resources, funding available to do things. So everything needs to be planned, everything needs to be, down to the last dollar, everything needs to be planned. Now, Congress wants to and committed to, providing the technology modernization the agencies need is essential for our national security, but we also need to have some assurance that that funding is utilized properly in an efficient manner. The old saying, whatever happened to measure twice and cut once, right? Whatever happened to that? Why is these delays happening? Why are we redoing work? Why aren't we planning everything right the first time so that we don't end up redoing work and costing the taxpayer all these expenses? Any one of you want to comment on that?
So I think some people don't want the answer of what a realistic business case could look like, right? When you think about the risks that were present on both of these programs from the very beginning, inexperienced shipbuilders, lack of experience with designing polar icebreakers in the case of that, bad business systems to be able to track progress and understand outcomes. These were all huge risks that were apparent at the beginning of the program that should have been factored into what the Coast Guard thought it was going to take in terms of time and funding to be able to execute them. But there's obviously a pressure to fit within a budget, right? And I think unfortunately that then leads to optimism in those business cases, and pushing forward with an optimistic business case has never, in my experience, worked out to get you something any quicker or any cheaper. It usually ends up costing probably what you thought it was gonna cost and taking probably what you thought it was, how long you probably thought it was gonna take. It's just that it wasn't planned from the beginning to be that. And so in that old adage of if you want it bad, you get it bad, I think that that's what we're seeing in a lot of these programs. And it's not unique to the Coast Guard. Major acquisitions across the federal government all fall victim to this. And I think as decision makers within the agencies and within Congress, we need to press these agencies to come with more realistic business cases so that we understand what we're getting into once the money starts flowing and it's hard to turn it off.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? How do we assure Congress, the taxpayer, the people, American people, that we have the capability to change from this practices to something moving from hope and optimism to proper planning and competency? How can you assure that? What would it take to go to a level of competency where taxpayers, Congress will feel assured that the funds will be used properly?
Congressman, I don't know how to change the incentives. I do know that the incentives in the bureaucracy, in the Navy, in the Coast Guard, and other departments do need to change so that there is not this preference or prevalence towards the optimism that Ms. Oakley talks about. I shared her perspective on that. I think there is a culture of optimism that creeps into new shipbuilding programs and new procurement programs in general for a variety of reasons that may be perfectly innocent along the way. Lots of little decisions get taken along the way that they don't compare to sort of what historical reality has been, and as a result, what comes out the other end is way too optimistic. Somehow we have to change the incentives so that we don't necessarily go with the lowest bidder, because the lowest bidder might not be submitting a realistic cost estimate, and they're trying to get the program locked in, and once it's locked in, then you've got a future where you're going to have to deal with that one way or another. But focusing on those incentives is one of the strategies I think that Congress should look at.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Oakley, Mr. O'Rourke, Mr. Labs, we're going to be focused on the Polar Security Cutter in my questioning here, because Bollinger Shipyards is a constituent in the state of Louisiana, and they have taken on the responsibility of completing this vessel. Shall we say, it was quite a mess that they have inherited, and they're shouldering that burden. So we're going to dig into the cost of this thing and how it was so outrageously underestimated, and what the design concerns have been throughout the inception of this incredibly expensive program that we are in the process of dealing with congressionally. What will the cost be? And we need realistic estimates. So we have the Government Accountability Office here, the Congressional Research Service here, and the Congressional Budget Office here for us. I'm very glad you're here. I appreciate you being here. So we should be able to get answers here. And specifically with regards to what are we doing everything we can to help the Bollinger Shipyards complete this program. It's an important program for the security of the United States, the Polar Security Cutter. On the last page of the CBO report, Mr. Labs, is stated that that generally speaking, for decades, naval cost for labor and materials runs higher than the commercial industry shipbuilding. Is that correct?
The cost of labor and materials in naval shipbuilding runs higher than inflation in the economy as a whole, not commercial shipbuilding, but the economy as a whole.
So without getting into the weeds of the culture of the Pentagon regarding spending over there, can we just accept that for some reason the world's biggest shipbuilder has greater impact from inflation, including in shipbuilding, than the rest of the nation's shipbuilding industry?
I'm not sure I quite understand your question, Congressman.
Okay. It's an assessment of your report, saying
Yes.
that it's more expensive for the Navy to build a ship because of labor and materials.
Correct, yes, sir.
Okay, than the commercial industry. But they are the world's largest shipbuilder. So one would, regular American would think that the world's largest shipbuilder might have more efficient programs and systems. Again, not to get into the weeds of Pentagon shipbuilding. Ms. Oakley, on page 21 of the GAO report, stepping into what was Halter Marine's project, it was their contract to build the PSC, the Polar Security Cutter, said that Halter likely overestimated the extent to which it could leverage the original design and underestimated the magnitude of design changes. You go on to speak of the complexity of the design work, late design revisions, and when Bollinger took over the program, they had to obviously embed their own design experts into the existing teams to try and work through these things. Is that correct?
Correct.
So we had design changes since inception and challenges that threatened this very important program.
Yes.
And somehow we just allowed that to move forward, and then Bollinger purchased Halter Marine. Now Bollinger has that to fix, and we're going to help them. So, Mr. O'Rourke, the CRS report, you state 5 primary reasons for massive increases in the PSC program estimated expense from the original estimates. Number 1, the actual PSC design is larger than the government's original design, what they anticipated, by 35%. Obviously, they have the 35% larger vessel, larger displacement is going to cost a lot more. Number 2, the Navy has frequently underestimated lead ship cost. The CBO averages 25 to 40% in a broad study across 19 programs, an average of 25 to 40% underestimated cost at inception for Navy shipbuilding. And our shipbuilders have to deal with this down the line. They're being told by the Navy, or you're overcost. You're overcost, when in reality, historically, the model seems to be that the United States Navy underestimates cost. Number 3, recent inflation in shipbuilding. You say the residual effects of inflationary pressures over the past few years and workforce challenges, plus increased labor and supply costs across the defense enterprise, all drove costs associated with our shipbuilding up roughly an additional 20%. Number 4, potential need for increases in workers' wages and benefits. Shipyards and associated supplier firms face challenges in recruiting and retaining new workers. And finally, schedule delays, which moves to design. You state that a principal cause of delay has been the time needed to achieve design maturity, meaning to complete the detailed design of the ship. So we have issues in the way we're rolling out shipbuilding in America. And the Polar Security Cutter is no exception to those issues. But we are responsible to address the larger issues, because we cannot continue to pretend that the original estimates for a shipbuilding project is going to fall within the parameters that are presented to Congress for funding. So we have questions we're going to submit in writing to Ms. Oakley, Mr. O'Rourke, and Mr. Labs. and we hope for a timely response on those written questions that we will submit to you. I thank you for being here. My time has
The
expired.
gentleman's
Mr.
time has
Chairman, I
expired.
yield.
I now recognize the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen.
Kalo Falava, and good morning. I want to thank Chairman Gimenez and Ranking Member Tanadar for allowing me to join the subcommittee today. And thank you to the panel for appearing. My question is for Ms. Oakley. Your statement emphasizes the importance of maturing and finalizing a ship's design before the contractor starts construction. This seems like common sense. In your opinion, why has completing the design before starting construction been so hard for the Coast Guard to do on its major shipbuilding programs?
I think it comes back to the incentives that are there to continue to push forward with a program to meet the unrealistic cost and schedule baselines that are set up. And so when you kind of have an unexecutable program from the very beginning, you begin to make decisions that add risk. And a decision to move forward with construction is certainly without the design being complete, is certainly something that adds risk to a program. Again, this isn't something that's unique to the Coast Guard, but it's certainly something that we have seen across many shipbuilding programs. This kind of focus on, well, we have enough complete to move forward. And then design changes happen, and they reverberate through things that have already been constructed, and that's where the real challenges lie. And so by completing the 100% of the basic and functional design and the systems that run throughout the ship, the design of the systems that run throughout the ship, it reduces that risk that there's going to be change, and therefore then you can reliably predict how quickly you're going to be able to construct the ship.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Radewagen. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and I too am saddened for the loss of our colleague, Rep. Payne, but I am also grateful for all the work he has done for this committee. Mr. Chairman, I'll be speaking on issues of such importance for my district and the general safety and security of the Pacific region. The U.S. Coast Guard serves a critical role in the Indo-Pacific region, from preventing illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU, to countering the Chinese Communist Party malign influence in providing much-needed aid during humanitarian missions to the Pacific countries, and the Coast Guard serves as our Pacific Swiss Army knife. The IUU fishing represents a critical threat to our national security and the health of fisheries. The Coast Guard leads law enforcement efforts to effectively counter these threats and stop the blatant intrusions of our sovereign waters. The existing fast response cutters also serve to prevent illegal migration to Guam, particularly the Chinese nationals that could very easily penetrate the island's defense and spy as a spy for their home nation. However, it is clear that the Coast Guard needs more cutters in Guam to properly accomplish their stated mission in the region. Captain Nicholas Simmons, the commander of the U.S. Coast Guard Forces Micronesian Sector Guam, has said that Guam Maritime Search and Rescue Region is 2/3 the size of the continental United States, that they patrol with 3 ships and 300 people. While we are grateful to hear the following, that this year the Coast Guard reauthorization of 2 more FRCs are on the way, the region can and must be served by more than just 5 small vessels. So my question, number 1, Mr. Warwick, is Guam has been called the tip of the spear for the United States in the Indo-Pacific region, and for good reason. The people of the Republic of China's maritime militia and distant water fishing operations pressure our allies and threaten regional security. So how does increasing the Coast Guard's capacity in the region directly respond to the threat that China poses? The Coast Guard has identified a need for increasing its operations and presence in the Indo-Pacific region to counter China and to serve other U.S. interests in the region. You mentioned one of those, which is EEZ enforcement, fisheries enforcement, both for U.S. EEZ waters and those of the Pacific Island countries. In connection with that, the Coast Guard has identified a need for, among other things, 6 additional fast response cutters to be assigned out into that region. Of those 6, 2 were funded in last year's appropriation, and another 2 are requested for procurement in this year's appropriation. The Coast Guard has also moved another older medium endurance cutter out into the region and engages in a wide range of not always well-reported or well-understood engagement activities with many of the countries in that region. All these things are directed at serving not just law enforcement missions, but also broader U.S. interests in countering China and strengthening our relationships with the countries in that region.
Thank you, Mr. Rourke. And in lieu of time here, just a couple more questions for you, please, sir. The FRCs are required to undergo maintenance every 4 years. This requires making a long journey back to Honolulu to dry dock and undergo repair. In your opinion, would the Coast Guard and the Navy benefit from a ship repair capacity on Guam and in the form of a dry dock?
That's possible, yes. It would depend on the costs, but yes, avoiding the longer transits back to the continental United States could increase time on station if the maintenance could be done locally rather than back in CONUS.
And quickly, just for my last question, this goes to Ms. Oakley. What are the top 3 most important things DHS and Coast Guard can do to improve the outcomes for their shipbuilding programs and get the capabilities out to the operators?
First, I think DHS, in its oversight role of the Coast Guard, can demand the Coast Guard to present better business cases for its programs that are based on realistic assessments of risk. And that would include not only what you can do from a requirements perspective, but also from a cost and schedule perspective as well. Second, I would say that the Coast Guard needs to begin to look toward these commercial companies that I mentioned before and identify how they could begin to incentivize their builders that they work with in the broader industrial base to operate more in that space, more how these commercial builders operate. And I think that the Congress also plays a role too. There are demands and accountability that the Congress can ask for from the Coast Guard and from DHS about the basis for its programs and what the realistic assessment is of those programs before they're approved, such that, once that funding spigot is turned on, it's not usually turned off pretty quickly.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you much. I'm going to start a second round. I do have some follow-up questions, and I'll start with myself, and then I'll yield to the ranking member. Ms. Oakley, it seems to me like when the Air Force is procuring a new fighter or a new plane, they put out the requirements, the mission of that plane, what the performance they expect out of that plane, and then they put those requirements out, and then companies will come back with their design that accomplishes that mission, correct? It appears that the Navy and the Coast Guard don't do it that way, for ships anyway. Do they put out these are the requirements of the ship, this is the size that we want the ship to be, how many people are gonna be on it, this is the mission of the ship, how fast we want it to be, what capability do we want, and then put it out to the shipbuilding industry, and then they come back with a design that says this is accomplished, and then they evaluate the designs and pick the winner. Do they do that, or is it something different here?
They do that, yeah. There is an effort there at the beginning to kind of put, here's what we want, can anybody do it out there, right? And that's
You said
where,
beginning.
yeah, at the
Beginning to do that.
no,
Beginning
no.
to do that, or they did that already?
They do that, yes.
Okay, so tell me how it is that 5 years after they did that,
Yeah.
and suppose they come back with a design that fits all the capabilities and all that, they still haven't started construction on this thing. Tell me how that's possible.
Yeah, I think that the Coast Guard is in the victim of the atrophied industrial base. And I know that I mentioned, things outside of their control. This is certainly one of the things outside their control. The number of shipyards in the United States that build ships in general has completely declined since the 1990s. And in particular, as you mentioned.
Could I stop you there a second? All right, so I went back to, you have a design, you have the capabilities, the specifications, how many people, okay. Did they put that out, and did somebody come back with, here's the design, here's the ship,
Here's what we can do, yes,
and what we can do?
yes.
Okay, that means that there was a shipbuilder that said, this is what we can do. So where is this industrial base thing all about? Because you wouldn't have had somebody come back to you and say, hey, we can build a ship, but really can't build a ship? Was it fantasy or what?
It happens all the time, unfortunately, in government acquisitions where contractors come back and say they can meet these requirements because they know, again, as I've mentioned a few times, once the spigot turns on, once the contract is let, it's unlikely to be canceled, right? And so when you think about, yeah, we can do it, here's what we can do, this is where it's incumbent on the Coast Guard and on DHS to critically evaluate what it is that they're getting from the contractor and how realistic it is that a contractor that's never built a polar icebreaker before in an industrial base that hasn't built a polar icebreaker in 50 years, how likely it's going to be that they're going to meet these cost and schedule goals and these targets for what the capability is going to provide.
Ms. Oakley, I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem that not one rivet has been put on anything on this. I don't know if they still use rivets, I don't know, okay? Or nobody has welded anything together yet. I could see you starting the program, I could see you starting building a ship, and then say, hey, wow, we're having difficulty with this, this, and this. But we haven't even started building the ship 5 years after somebody was awarded a contract to deliver something they said they could deliver.
Yeah. For the Polar Security Cutter, they are building prototype units. So some things are being built right now on the ship, prototype blocks that they're using to learn about the specialized welding techniques that they have to use for the steel that's required for a polar icebreaker. So there is some initial construction that's going on right now. And my question about that for the Coast Guard that I would be interested in if I were you is how are they learning from that and how are they incorporating that into their construction plan going forward for how long and how much it's going to take?
Okay, this is not convincing me, okay? Because this is not like, gee, we are building a spaceship to go to Saturn. Nobody's ever built one before, okay? So we're building an icebreaker,
Yeah.
which a bunch of countries, even friendly to us, build icebreakers, right? And they know the welding techniques, and they know all the steel that's necessary. Are we trying to reinvent a wheel here that's already been invented all around the world?
It's true that, many of our allies around the world are building icebreakers and have built icebreakers and are pretty effective at it. We did not take that approach. We're obviously, needing to use a U.S. shipyard to build these ships, and I think that capability, since we haven't done it in a long time, is needing to be built back up, and that's what I was getting at with the industrial base.
Okay, my time has expired. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez. Just quick question. I just want to understand the procurement process. How was these contractors chosen? What's the process? Is the procurement, is the applications come from all over the world, or is this only domestic producers? What's the whole process like?
In general, and for the PSC program, there was an operational requirement that the Coast Guard spent many years defining. They put that out for bidding. It was an open competition. They received bids from at least 3 shipbuilders. All the bidders were required to show what parent design they were proposing to use as the basis for the new cutter. And the Coast Guard evaluated the bids that it received, the 3 at least that were reported publicly, and chose the one that it thought best. And that was Halter's design. Halter said their parent design would be the German icebreaker Polarstern II, which was a new polar research ship for Germany. Halter said that they went through 6 or 7 design spirals to take the German design and turn it into what they were presenting to the Coast Guard in the bidding process. And the Coast Guard evaluated that proposal along with the others that it received and chose halter. So there was a requirement that the Coast Guard actually spent many years to define and make very specific. This was done at a time when the Polar Security Cutter wasn't getting a lot of funding, so there wasn't much else the Coast Guard could do except study the requirements to a very fine degree. And then they received the bids. They went with the one that they thought was the best. It was the halter design. And what turned out, apparently, is that the halter design, even having gone through the design spirals after receiving the design from Germany, turned out to need a lot more change than they thought. And the volume of design work to then get to a mature design turned out to be much greater than was anticipated. And then that was exacerbated by limits on the numbers of naval architects and naval engineers that could be applied to working that design task down. And that is why things have proceeded so slowly and gradually since then.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Radwagen or Mr. Moran, do you want a follow-up? Okay, I yield to, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Radwagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Dr. Labs, your estimate that you present to us today pins the total cost of the PSC program almost 60% higher than the Coast Guard's current estimate. You have a long record of assessing the Navy's shipbuilding programs. Is it common that your estimates are that much higher than the Navy's original estimate?
You're right, Congresswoman. I have been doing this for a long time. Sometimes my estimates are that much higher than the Navy's, sometimes even higher. I recently put out an estimate on the Navy's medium landing ship that is essentially double what the Navy's current estimate is. Back in the 2000s, I estimated a new destroyer program at 50% higher than what the Navy was estimating. It took 15 years, but the Navy has estimated the final cost of that ship ultimately reached very close to what my initial estimate was back in the mid-2000s. So yes, there's been a range of numbers. It will vary from ship program to ship program, but 60% is not common, but it's not unheard of.
So, Dr. Labs, on average, how do CBO estimates usually compare with the Navy's original estimate for a given program? Looks like you've partially answered that. Is there a pattern?
Well, I think the pattern that I have observed over the years is that CBO consistently has estimates that are higher than the Navy's. In the vehicle of which this is most often done is through the annual shipbuilding analysis that CBO is required to do by statute of the Navy's 30-year shipbuilding plan. I go through those programs one by one, ship program by ship program. And what you see from one year to the next is that I will put out an estimate in 1 year's analysis, and then a couple years down the road, the Navy will be changing their estimates along the way so that those gaps get closer. And I have, generally speaking, have not substantially overpriced a ship yet that I'm aware of. Certainly not a lead ship program. All too often that what happens is that even though I have an estimate that is a good deal higher than the Navy's, it's just as frequently possible that I am still underestimating the cost of that ship program. And the PSC is one of those examples today where even using the Navy's, the Coast Guard's own information, if you look, for example, at their first life cycle cost estimate analysis, where they had a 13,000-ton light ship displacement ship for, about a little more than $1 billion. If you looked at that metric and then applied that cost metric to the current design, you could come up with an estimate that's higher than the CBO estimate is today. So that is the way I would answer your question at this point.
Mr. O'Rourke, you also have spent significant time in your career assessing Navy and Coast Guard shipbuilding programs. What causes the Coast Guard's estimates to come in so much lower than the actual cost? And does the Coast Guard's track record in shipbuilding mirror the Navy's in terms of programs coming under or over budget, ships being delivered on time or late, and the overall programs being managed well or poorly?
To build on what Eric said, and to get to the question that you put to Eric, it's been my observation over the years in observing the differences between the CBO's estimates, Eric's estimates, and the Navy's, that eventually the answer is going to settle a lot more closer to Eric's than it will to the Navy's. It may take some time, but you asked if there was a pattern, and in my observation, that's the pattern. It's going to be closer to what Eric says. It may take some time to get there, but that has been the pattern. Now, as for why you have services underestimating costs, I would say that there are three reasons, and Ms. Oakley mentioned one of them, and Eric also commented on it, which is that at the start of a program, if there's a range of uncertainty about what a ship might cost, there's an incentive to set the number at the lower end of the range so as to help get the program started and established. A second cause, I believe, in looking at this over many years is that when people in the program offices bring programs forward, they're allowed to talk about how doing it differently this time will save money in one regard or another. A new shipbuilding process, the CAD/CAM technology that was mentioned earlier, for example, or different manufacturing techniques. And they can identify those and take credit for them and roll them into the cost estimates. What they can't identify ahead of time and roll into the cost estimate is what may go wrong, because they don't know what that is. So they're allowed to fold in the stuff that can lower the cost. They're not really at liberty to then put a wedge in for stuff that will go wrong. And as a result, the estimate tends to be biased toward the optimistic for that reason as well. Eric gets around
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Rourke, speaking about numbers, this year's budget for the Coast Guard was $1.5 billion. What will be a more realistic number do you think that they need to adequately fulfill their mission and their acquisition needs?
Right. What funding level in the Coast Guard's procurement account would more adequately take care of their needs? The Coast Guard itself testified to that several years ago, and the figure they provided at that time was $2 to $2.5 billion. And if you were to adjust that into today's dollars, that would be more like $2.5 to $3 billion a year. A figure of $3 billion a year would be twice what the request is this year.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The witnesses are dismissed, and the committee will stand in brief recess while the clerks arrange for the second panel of witnesses. The committee will come to order. I am pleased to welcome our second panel of witnesses. I ask that the witnesses please rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. I would now like to formally introduce our second panel of witnesses. Vice Admiral Thomas serves as the U.S. Coast Guard's Deputy Commandant for Mission Support. Mr. Randolph Tex Alls, did I pronounce that right? Alice serves as the Undersecretary for Management for the Department of Homeland Security. I thank each of our distinguished witnesses for being here today. I now recognize Vice Admiral Thomas for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Good afternoon, Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanadar, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My written testimony has been provided, and I request to have it entered into the official record.
Without objection.
On behalf of our Commandant, I want to first offer my deepest condolences to the family, friends, and colleagues of Representative Payne. We are deeply appreciative of his steadfast support of our Coast Guard and our Coast Guard women and men. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about the Coast Guard's ongoing activities to recapitalize the service's assets and capabilities and efforts to meet increasing mission demands across the nation and around the world for our Coast Guard. Over the next 10 years, to answer increased call for the service's unique capabilities, the Coast Guard will field new assets, expand our enduring presence in critical areas like the Arctic and the Indo-Pacific, build new infrastructure, and grow our workforce to operate these assets. To do so, the Coast Guard, under the guidance of the Department of Homeland Security, is investing in a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of acquisition programs to meet the nation needs of today and tomorrow. We are guided by a comprehensive framework of acquisition policies, informed by statutory and regulatory requirements, and leveraging the best practices identified by GAO and others as we oversee our acquisition programs. To meet the growing needs for Coast Guard presence and to protect the nation's strategic objectives in the polar regions, the Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy have established an integrated program office to design and deliver a fleet of 3 polar security cutters. This arrangement leverages each service's experience and expertise in large, complex vessel acquisition programs. The Integrated Program Office has awarded a contract for the detailed design and construction of the lead polar security cutter. Detailed design activities are underway, and the prime contractor has begun limited activities to support early production through a prototype fabrication assessment program. Even with this innovative production process, we know that we cannot build these national assets alone. The defense industrial base plays a critical role in supporting our national security and economic prosperity. We are not just investing in the polar security cutter here, we are investing in national capability to build and field large, complex vessels, the capability the nation needs to meet demands around the world. However, we face large-scale economic and geopolitical challenges to do so. While Americans have long prided ourselves on our ability to do big and complex things, the world has changed and we have work to do. The defense industrial base underwent significant consolidation over the last 2 decades in an attempt to reduce costs and operate more efficiently. An unintended consequence of this consolidation was the erosion of the defense industrial base expertise and capacity to produce military vessels, despite the demand signal for recapitalization and growth of our fleets. Additionally, much of the global expertise in ship design has moved overseas, placing an even greater burden on our domestic shipbuilders. Moreover, lagging investment in capital infrastructure at our shipyards has eroded our nation's ability to produce the largest, most complex ships, such as the Polar Security Cutter. Today's challenges go beyond the infrastructure investment, though. Equally concerning, America's defense industrial base is encountering some of the same challenges our services are with regard to recruiting and retaining a workforce. The increased demand for highly trained welders, pipe fitters, and other trades, along with design engineers and technical experts, is just one example of how workforce challenges are contributing to delays and cost increases across the Coast Guard shipbuilding portfolio. With a concentration of shipyards supporting Coast Guard and Navy programs on the Gulf Coast of our nation, competition between shipyards for labor amplifies the challenge. I appreciate the continued bipartisan support of this committee, and I look forward to continue to work with you on advancing our recapitalization efforts. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today and for all that you do for the women and men of the United States Coast Guard. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Vice Admiral Thomas, and I recognize Mr. Alice for 5 minutes to summarize his opening statements.
Chairman Gimenez, Ranking Member Thanador, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, it's a privilege to appear before you today to discuss how the Management Director of the Department supports recapitalization of the Coast Guard fleet. I would also like to express my condolences to the committee for the loss of Mr. Payne, a tragic situation. As noted, I serve as the Deputy Undersecretary for Management, and I have since July of 2019. In that capacity, I oversee the department-wide management and oversight of all mission support functions, such as information technology, budget and financial management, procurement, acquisition, human capital, security, and asset management. In my role as the Deputy Undersecretary of Management, I'm also the Chief Acquisition Officer for the department. The Management Director works collaboratively with the Coast Guard to oversee the acquisition of maritime and aviation fleets needed by our frontline personnel to protect the homeland. As Chief Acquisition Officer of the department, I recognize the critical role effective acquisition management plays in meeting mission needs. Being proactive in security efforts across the department's various mission sets requires the acquisition community to work hard to streamline efforts without sacrificing our ability to execute the department's missions. DHS acquisition programs vary in size, scope, and cost. Collectively, the department's acquisition program portfolio works together to provide security for our nation's borders, both land and maritime. As a comment on the Coast Guard has previously conveyed, we have never experienced a greater demand for Coast Guard services, and we anticipate this demand to grow in the future. At the department, we are focused on facilitating the delivery of capabilities to meet these demands and confront the dynamic and complex challenges faced by Coast Guard personnel. We need new and more capable cutters, aircraft, boats, and command and control and communication systems that are required to support mission execution domestically in some of the most challenging environments around the world, including the polar regions, the Indo-Pacific region, and the Persian Gulf. Recapitalization of the Coast Guard is an important priority of the department, and we are focused on effective program oversight and governance to ensure that the investment in our critical assets is the greatest opportunity to meet the mission needs at an affordable cost and in a timely manner to support our personnel. These acquisitions require executable strategies that consider the need to plan and scope acquisitions before work begins, to oversee the design and production processes, and prepare future crews and maintenance community and the maintenance community for the delivery of future operational capabilities. By teaming with component acquisition executives, program managers, and other acquisition professionals, the department's goal is to enhance these acquisition activities, which provide the appropriate number of checks and balances to promote better outcomes in achieving program success. Among the active Coast Guard shipbuilding efforts, DHS is currently governing 6 of these programs as major acquisitions, either as Level 1 programs, meaning that they exceed $1 billion, or Level 2 programs with lifecycle cost exceeding $300 million. These programs are also in various stages of the department's acquisition lifecycle framework, from established programs at the tail end of production, such as our national security cutters and fast response cutters, to more recent programs that are in the earlier phase of acquisition, such as the Polar Security Cutter and the Waterway Commerce Cutters. The Coast Guard's new shipbuilding programs include ongoing construction at 5 private shipyards across the United States, with a preponderance of the activities for building the major cutters centered in the Gulf Coast region of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. We recognize that the shipbuilding industry as a whole is facing pressure from diminished industrial base capacity. The main issues limiting private shipbuilders in the long term lies in the lack of personnel, rising costs of materials, and fluctuating acquisition priorities. Along with the rest of the industry, our Coast Guard programs are also seeing challenges caused by these issues. As legacy cutters continue to age, maintaining the older ships will be more of a challenge due to cost and obsolescence. With that in mind, we continually strive to improve our acquisition process with a focus on meeting mission performance at an affordable cost within the required schedule. Thank you again for your attention to this important mission and for the opportunity to discuss the Management Directorate's governance of critical Coast Guard shipbuilding efforts. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Alice. Members will be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning, and I recognize myself for my 5 minutes of questioning. Vice Admiral, where does the buck stop? we've got a cutter, I mean, I'm sorry, we have a icebreaker that we put out a contract for 5 years ago. We have not even started construction on it. So where does the buck stop? Whose fault is that? And what have we done to resolve this issue?
Congressman, I appreciate your frustration because I share it. And, you know, in the case of the polar icebreaker, you had a conversation earlier in the last panel about how it really works. You know, the Coast Guard does not design the ship. We let a contract for that includes the detailed design of that ship. Our first contractor, early on, I believe, decided they were going to try to get out of this deal, and they essentially stopped designing the ship. They made very, very little progress. They talked about their subcontractor not delivering, et cetera. Now that we have a new prime contractor, we're making very good progress on that detailed design. We have taken some action to restructure the contract, to put additional resources after it, more engineers, for example. There are a lot of roadblocks, but right now, the buck stops with me, and I am focused on getting to detailed design and construction because our nation needs the ship, and our nation needs the shipyard, and that's our focus.
Give me a time. When will you be done with design? When will construction stop? And I'm gonna hold you to it. So what is the time?
We intend to begin construction late this year,
What's late this year?
probably in December. We are currently building prototype modules that will become part of the ship. We will not be at the level of design maturity that the GAO would like to see when we do that.
In December, I'll call you back.
And
And
we
I will call you back in December, okay? And we're going to see where we are with this icebreaker. The offshore patrol cutter, suppose we're having trouble with that. How many of these are we procuring?
Well, we currently have a program of record of 25 ships. We've awarded the Stage 1 contract for hulls 1 through 4. Those are being built at Eastern Shipbuilding, Ship Group. And then we have a contract for 5.
Hulls 1 through 4, are they started construction?
Yes, sir. All 3 are under construction. Hull 1 is in the water. She'll be delivered in May of next year.
When was the original contract given?
That ship will be, well,
The original contract, when was the original
contract
contract?
delivery date was in May of '24. I don't remember, I got that here, but the ship
For
will
the
be,
is that for the first ship, May of '24?
the ship will be late, just like most.
Is the program late?
Yes, sir. That program is behind schedule and behind an over-target budget, and we're working to adjust that.
For both the Navy and the Coast Guard, I'm hearing the same thing, that the industrial base that we have lack of skilled workers in the industrial base. Is that your assessment? Welders, et cetera, the things that we actually need to build a ship, the people that we actually need to build the ships, are we short of those kind of skills, that kind of skill sets here in the United States?
Yes, we are, sir, and that's one of the reasons why the estimates vary so wildly, because
No, hold on, that's just a yes or no answer then. Okay, so what is the Coast Guard, what is the Navy doing about that?
the Navy has some authorities to actually do something about that, including spending money to train people in key trades that they need, particularly for building submarines. The Coast Guard doesn't have those authorities, although we do work closely with the Navy so that they understand our needs as well, and they target those monies to the trades that we need as well.
Do you think you need that authority?
As I said, right now, we work very closely with the Navy, and we leverage their authority, so I think we're okay. If we were to have the authority, then we would need the same appropriations that the Navy has in order to have the money to actually.
Do those skill sets exist around the world?
There are labor challenges in shipbuilding around the world,
Around the world, okay.
at least in the Western world.
Fair enough, okay. Vice Admiral, I will be bringing you back on in December. I still will be here in December, okay? And I'm going to probably be here after that too. But in December, for sure, I'll be here. And so we'll be having this conversation again about the cutter and then also these programs that are falling behind. I just feel it's completely inexcusable that a contract was let 5 years ago and we haven't even started construction on it, especially when supposedly the design was built, was already, Here's the design, here's the ship, here we go, and then nothing. And if somebody was giving you trouble and delaying you, you should have known about that. So with that, my time is expired. I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez. Several questions here. I wonder if we have enough of an expertise in-house, shipbuilding expertise. Expertise to oversee the shipbuilders, expertise to evaluate their submissions, expertise to monitor it. Do we have enough in-house expertise? And if not, what can you do to build such an expertise so we can effectively monitor these acquisitions and oversight?
Well, one of the reasons that we have an integrated project office with the Navy is so that we can leverage their expertise as well as the Coast Guard expertise, particularly given the complexity of the polar security cutter in this case. And our expertise is typically around smaller vessels. As a nation, we need to make sure we don't lose this expertise. We need to support STEM programs because we are not building the engineers as a nation that our near-peer competitors are building. And so that's a concern across shipbuildings, across the maritime or the military industrial base. It is a real concern, and I appreciate you noticing that.
How, well, not only domestically, United States, but worldwide, where can we go get this expertise if we need some?
Well, I mean, in the case of the polar security cutter, I think the chairman mentioned earlier that, there is real expertise in icebreakers in places like Finland. That's where we went when we first put out the proposal and we had to choose an indicative design. We said we want something like this. They came back and we didn't provide them a design. We said, here's the requirements. Here's one that's pretty close. They came back and said, we want to use this design over here. And then, by the way, the ship that they chose for the parent design has actually never been constructed. And that's why the detailed design has taken so long.
Thank you. Now, Admiral Thomas, I represent much of Detroit, Michigan. My constituents depend upon maritime commerce and tourism on the Great Lakes. In fact, 55% of the Great Lakes regional economy is dependent on key shipping channels, according to Coast Guard. We have heard a lot about Polar Security Cutter Program, how the Coast Guard struggles to respond to mission needs in the Arctic, but is the same true on Great Lakes, where Coast Guards rely on a fleet of aging vessels? What mix of small, medium, and heavy icebreakers does the Coast Guard believe it will need in the Great Lakes? And what can Congress do to support the Coast Guard's Great Lakes icebreaking effort and acquisitions?
Well, thank you for the question. The Coast Guard is committed to recapitalizing our system of icebreakers on the Great Lakes because it takes a system. It takes the small, medium, and the large in order to get those ships all the way to the pier. We believe that we need about two heavies, and in this case, a heavy would be equivalent to the Mackinac, which is currently there. About 11 of what is currently a 140-foot tug, and about 8 of the smaller ones that can work closer to the piers. And we have, we've gotten some support from Congress, particularly to build another Great Lake heavy icebreaker. We got enough money in the budget last year to begin the acquire phase of the acquisition program, analyze and acquire. We're going to need another $20 million to finish that phase, but we have started.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Admiral. And I yield back.
The ranking member yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Thomas, Mr. Alice, thank you for being here today. Admiral Thomas, you got 39 years in the rearview mirror in your uniform, huh, sir? And thank you for your service. My understanding is that you'll be retiring soon, and we wish you the best. I'm an old Army veteran, NCO, and a couple of my district staff members are prior Army, combat veteran, another NCO, and a lieutenant colonel. So we were predisposed to love Army in my office, but in my district, South Louisiana, we have so much interaction with the Coast Guard. The last 8 years have been a real awakening for the old Army veterans in my office at just how squared away the Coast Guard is. So if you've been there for 39 years, my brother, then you're partly responsible for just how impressive the United States Coast Guard is. So thank you for that service. And regarding these vessels and getting them finished and built, figuring out what's wrong, we're going to do that. We're going to work together. Congress is going to work with the Coast Guard and the Navy. We're going to identify what the problems have been, and we're going to iron them out. You have an excellent shipbuilder on the Polar Security cutter now in Bollinger Shipyards. So we're gonna fix these issues, and I thank you for your service, sir. Admiral, clearly in the last panel we identified some challenges that we must overcome with two major vessel programs, including the Polar Security cutter. Can you please describe the relationship between the Navy, the Department of Defense, the Coast Guard, as it pertains to the Polar Security cutter? Like, who's in charge? Which government entity has the ultimate decision-making authority when it comes to interacting with the shipbuilder? Can you clear that up for America?
Well, first, Congressman, thank you. It's been a privilege to serve for 39 years, and I am retiring in July, so I just signed my relief up to meet the chairman in December. But the Coast Guard and the Navy work very, very closely on the Polar Security cutter. The Coast Guard really is driving the requirements and the design review, and we have a joint office with the Navy down at the shipyard. And the Navy helps us. It is a Navy contract, not a Coast Guard contract, so that's really where the Navy plays the biggest role, is in contract modifications. But we tell them what we would like to see, and they've been very helpful in that regard.
So contract modification, you said that's the major role that the Navy plays, that the Coast Guard is driving what the needs are for the design, but the Navy is responsible for actual contract modification with the shipbuilder. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, we work together on that. So the Coast Guard is driving the train with regard to what it's going to take to get this ship, and that includes regular meetings with the ownership of that yard.
Yes, sir.
Understanding where they are, and then understanding how the contract must be modified so that we get both a ship and a shipyard, and then we go and we work with the Navy to make those necessary modifications.
Mr. Alice, do you have anything to add to that question regarding the relationship between the Coast Guard and the Navy and the shipbuilder?
Just as the Admiral said, sir, the contract is Navy, but they respond to the requirements the Coast Guard gives them. The money, at this point, purchasing the cutter is DHS money through DHS appropriations. Initial money for the contract was shipbuilding, construction, Navy, which is why the contract went to them originally. Now it's DHS money. So they are very responsive, as the Admiral said.
Okay, well, we're going to work closely with the Coast Guard, the Navy, and the shipbuilder to help these projects move forward, get back on track. Admiral, closing question here regarding unmanned systems, the strategic plan. Last year, the Coast Guard released a report highlighting that the use of unmanned systems is critical for mission readiness. Has the Coast Guard thought about incorporating autonomous vessels into its fleet? What's the status of that?
Thank you, Congressman. You mentioned we have a strategy for incorporation of unmanned systems. Right now, our focus really is on aerial systems. We have experimented with unmanned or autonomous surface vessels as well, but we're working to develop those CONOPS, and definitely in the future, we will need those systems.
We'll talk more about that. My time has expired. Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. And Admiral, I also want to thank you for your service. Please let your successor know, he or she, that they'll be back here in December to talk about this, the polar icebreaker. Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I represent American Samoa in the South Pacific. Our largest industry is fishing, which is at threat from Chinese IUU fishing. Coast Guard presence in American Samoa is the best deterrence from Chinese incursions into our EEZ. Every single Pacific Island leader has asked for two things in the Pacific: Coast Guard and the Peace Corps. Today, we're discussing the fleet of the future, one that can operate in the South Pacific. American Samoa recently just hosted the Commandant of the Coast Guard, Admiral Fagan, in February, and American Samoa stands ready to host a larger permanent presence of the Coast Guard. With the success of the Harriet Lane's tour of the Indo-Pacific, I'd like to focus on OPC. My first question is for Admiral Thomas. With regard to its aging fleet, what are the operational consequences the Coast Guard is currently and anticipates facing due to delays in the OPC and PSC programs? What operational and financial trade-offs are the Coast Guard having to make as a result?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I know the Commandant told me she really enjoyed her visit with you there. Yeah, the delays in the offshore patrol cutter have caused us to undertake a service life extension program for our 270-foot Harriet Lane type ships. And we're doing that in order to maintain that capability and that capacity until we can get the offshore patrol cutter into full production. And that, you know, eventually that would be 2 ships per year.
Thank you. For my next question, and both you and Mr. Ellis can answer, what lessons learned from OPC Stage 1 has the Coast Guard collected and will proactively apply to mitigate design and construction delays on Stage 2?
I think I would just comment the Stage 2 program is progressing quite well at this point. Design is coming along well. They've done their initial critical design reviews, so we're very encouraged by what we're seeing from the Austal contractor there. Lessons learned from OPC 1 have clearly been incorporated into that effort, and we're seeing good progress.
Admiral Thomas?
No, I agree with everything Mr. Ellis said. The primary contractor for Stage 2 is progressing very, very well on the design, and we expect to begin production on that ship this year as well.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, what are the biggest risks to OPC's Stage 2, and what is the Coast Guard doing to mitigate them? What off-ramps does the Coast Guard have in place to de-scope requirements, if needed, to get ships out faster, and is this enough?
So I would say the biggest risk to Stage 2 is the availability of labor. Again, because that shipyard is on the Gulf Coast with all the other shipyards that are doing a lot of work for both the Navy and the Coast Guard. They have a lot of Navy work in that very shipyard as well, so their ability to get the number of laborers they need to deliver those ships on time is the biggest risk.
I think likewise agree with Admiral Thomas's response. I think also there is the competition with the Navy itself, so we will make sure we stay in the fight there for our production.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moreland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Admiral, all 3 FRCs currently stationed in Guam are due for repair next year. What's the Coast Guard's plan for the region during this time when the FRCs will be completely absent from Guam's area of responsibility? And how can we ensure that this gap in service and structure will never happen again?
So all 3 of those vessels will go into dry dock, but not at the same time. We will sequence them, so there will always be 2 in Guam. And then very likely we'll home port another FRC there in the coming 2 or 3 years.
Good to hear. Thank you. Second question, Vice Admiral. I recently had a chance to host Chairman Sam Grace to see Guam's Upper Harbor breakwater. And I continued working with both the Department of the Navy and the House Armed Services Committee to find solutions on how the marine infrastructure can be repaired. The breakwater is just one typhoon away from completely washing out and rendering Upper Harbor useless. If this was to happen, what will be the impact on the Coast Guard operations and the capacity in Sector Guam?
So I've been to Apple Harbor as well, and I share your concern. Obviously, if we lose that breakwater and the ability to have sheltered moorings there, we would not be able to operate out of Guam, at least not on a full-time basis. So it is a concern for us.
It's considered an emergency, and I appreciate your continued push to get this repaired as quickly as possible. And for my final question, Vice Admiral, as the Deputy Commandant for Mission Support, we have received reports from senior Coast Guard leaders in Guam about the need for increased capability and personnel support for operations out of Guam. What, if anything, have your commanders said to you about what it takes to realize their needs in supporting Homeland's mission in Guam? And what steps have been taken to address the stated concerns?
Coast Guard commanders around the world tell me they don't have enough to do what they need to do, and they are right. 2018, we had a PC&I budget of $2.6 billion. You just heard in 2025, it's 1.6. We're going in the wrong direction. We need at least a $3 billion PC&I budget to do all the infrastructure work that we need to do around the nation, and we simply are going in the wrong direction. So I hear that everywhere I go. It's one of the greatest frustrations of being the guy responsible to provide things that float and fly, have runways and roofs, and I can't do it.
I can imagine the pressure you're facing, and I really appreciate your experience and support in fighting for the Coast Guard. For the Indo-PACOM area, for Guam and the Free Associated States, and American Samoa as well, we rely on you heavily to protect our fisheries, and most especially keeping out the CCP from our area. We just can't do it without your support, so we're going to fight for you. I appreciate that, and thank you for your service, sir.
Thank you. Our members love serving out there.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I'm going to do a second short round of questioning for those that want to. Admiral Thomas, do you have in the Coast Guard, do you have a number of engineers, naval architects, et cetera, that work for the Coast Guard that help you?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I am, in fact, MIT-trained naval architect. We have a number of naval architects who both work on our ships and work on review of design for commercial vessels that we regulate. So that is an expertise that we do have in our force, both on our civilian side and our military side.
Does the Navy have the same kind of setup over on their side?
Yes, Congressman, they do. In fact, while I was in grad school for naval architect, most of my classmates were Navy officers.
Do you guys, does the Navy and the Coast Guard, are you co-located, or do you talk to each other? I mean, do you operate separately? Do you operate quasi together, or is it just separate? Coast Guard here, Navy there?
We're integrated to the point where we actually do exchanges of some of our employees so that we can get our Coast Guard members some experience working on Navy projects and vice versa. So we're talking to NAVC, their ship design headquarters is just across the river from Coast Guard headquarters, so we are there often.
Or there often? Okay. But you're not co-located technically, you're not together. There's across the river, right?
Yes, sir, but as I said, we do have embeds, and they have embeds with us.
Okay, fair enough. You said that you needed more money. Everybody in the federal government says they need more money, and I tend to agree with you, you probably do. The submission that you gave to the administration, was that pared down by the administration?
Just like every component of the agency, we are given a top line that we have to stay underneath, and we have to make hard choices in order to get underneath that top line, which is why you see so much on an unfunded priorities list. And in the case particularly of the Polar Security Cutter, we will not be able to build that ship from money within our base and still do everything else the nation needs us to do. We need top-line relief in order to build the Polar Security Cutter. We have not gotten that, and that relief has to really be at the department level, so it doesn't come from department priorities as well.
All right, so you don't have the money to build the icebreaker that you need? Is that what you're telling me? You don't have the money to do that? For our nation's security, you don't have the money to do that?
What I'm telling you, sir, is that with the current top lines that we are given to build a budget to, we cannot build a polar icebreaker and still produce 2 OPCs per year and transition our rotary wing fleet to H-60s and build C-130s and build waterway commerce cutters. We cannot do it. And so if we're forced to do it within our base, we're going to have to make some really tough choices, which includes probably curtailing the OPC program or perhaps flying less aircraft, which will really hurt our ability to provide the same level of service to the nation.
And will you provide that information to Congress as what you can do with the money that Congress is allocating to you, instead of saying, well, yeah, we will do all these things, knowing full well you can't do all these things?
Absolutely happy to provide a brief. We do come up once a quarter and brief where we are in acquisitions. But we can definitely provide you a brief on what we will and will not be able to do if we stay at a $1.5 billion PC&I budget.
Well, I think what we need to know is what is it you believe you need to maintain the national security of the United States, what equipment you need, how much it will cost, and then what you can actually do with the budget that's allocated to you. And so I would like to see that. With that, I yield the balance of my time, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Thanadar.
Thank you, Chairman Gimenez, and thank you to our panelists here. Mr. Alice, and Admiral Thomas, I appreciate the hard work of the men and women of U.S. Coast Guard. I appreciate your long service, and I wish you, a very happy retirement. As I look at all these cost overruns and the delays and how expensive these programs have become, and obviously you have a limited budget. What are these additional expenses, additional cost? What's that? How is that impacting? What programs is that impacting? And as you try to cut costs, what does that do to our national security?
I would just say that obviously, as the Admiral mentioned, it means trade-offs. Trade-offs in mission performance. It'll possibly mean trade-offs in the department where we put money. It's going to have to come from somewhere to support Coast Guard mission sets. But it is a national priority that the Secretary takes seriously, will have to be evaluated. I would mention that as we think about costs overall, we have seen a very dramatic acceleration across all of our building areas, not just shipbuilding, just building, construction, labor, materials costs have accelerated much more rapidly than the consumer price index, in some cases up to 80%. So that's been a big impact. The pandemic has had a lasting effect overall, and we're navigating that.
Thank you. And that's all the questions I have. I yield back.
The ranking member yields. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from American Samoa, Ms. Radewagen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Thomas, can you go into how the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse is affecting the work at the Coast Guard Yard, especially in regards to the 270 service life extensions?
Thank you for that question. I'd love any opportunity to talk about the Coast Guard Yard. Fortunately, we've not experienced any adverse impacts from the bridge collapse, so we have a deep enough channel open now to get our ships back and forth. But the Coast Guard Yard is another place where the nation needs to invest. We are not going to be able to service our own ships. The new ships are too big for the current facilities at the Coast Guard Yard. We need to maintain that ability in-house so that we can keep the military-industrial base competitive. When they know they're the only game in town, it becomes really difficult. So we, as a nation, need to invest in the Coast Guard Yard, and particularly in a dry dock that can lift the OPC and the NSC.
So this question is for Mr. Alice and Admiral Thomas. Secretary Mayorkas recently testified to the Senate Homeland Security Appropriations Committee that the Coast Guard is underfunded. Do you agree with the Secretary? Does the Coast Guard have the necessary assets to fulfill all 11 of the service's statutory mission sets? What more is needed to fill in the operational gaps?
So I would agree with the statement that underfunded. The department has historically been underfunded overall at the level of many $billions. This rolls over on the Coast Guard programs. I won't give an amount they need. That's something I would think we probably can provide back to the committee, but definitely the funding levels are not sufficient to do all the mission sets for the Coast Guard, and defer to Admiral Thomas.
Well, the chairman said it earlier, the demand for the Coast Guard around the globe has never been higher. We're being asked to be more places more often and for longer periods of time, and our budget has been flatlined. In particular, our PC&I budget, as I mentioned, has gone in the wrong direction. So we are underfunded, and we will have to make some tough choices if we continue to be underfunded.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Guam, Mr. Moreland.
No further questions, Mr. Chairman. I just want to thank the panel. Thank you very much.
The gentleman yields back. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to these in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.